We learned a lot about higher order components. Let's go back to our regular components, so to say. And there we have components like our app.js component here, our app component, that do use state. This one is a class-based component. And what I want to show you now only matters for class-based components that use the state property and that therefore use setState to update that state. Now, good news is we're using setState correctly here. Bad news is you can use it incorrectly, but I will show you how and how to avoid it. So how could you use it in an invalid way? Let's say that whenever our name changes and we execute the name changed handler, we want to count that. So we essentially count every keystroke made or every change made. So in our name changed handler here, we would not just want to update persons, but also some counter we keep track of. Now, therefore, we can, of course, add a counter to our state object here, change counter, and that starts at 0. And in name changed handler, we now call setState, and we set change counter equal. And now, of course, this always depends on the old state, right? Because we want to increment it by 1. So we need the old change counter plus 1. And therefore, of course, we can say this state change counter plus 1. And now we have a setup where we should increment the change counter. If I save this, let me bring up the React developer tools so that we can actually inspect our current state of the app component. So there we see the change counter. And if I target my persons and I start typing here Maximilian, you see this go up and you see that go down. So it seems to work, right? And yet it is the wrong way of updating this. Behind the scenes, setState does not immediately trigger an update of the state of this component and a re-render cycle. Instead, it's basically scheduled by React, and React will then perform the state update and the re-render cycle when it has the available resources to do that. So when it basically decides that now is a good point of time to do that. Typically, that will of course be instantly, especially in simple applications like this one, but it's not guaranteed. And I want you to memorize this because that is really important. You call setState synchronously here, but it's not guaranteed to execute and finish immediately. And therefore, this state, when used for a state update, is not guaranteed to be the latest state or the previous state on which you depend. It could be an older state. Let's say you're also calling setState somewhere else in your application, which happens almost simultaneously to this setState update. And for some reason, this does not execute immediately and the other setState update finishes earlier, something like this. Then the state you're depending on here might be an unexpected state. It might not be the previous state you would expect it to be. And therefore, there is a better way of updating state when you're depending on the old state. setState does not only take a JavaScript object, it also works when you pass in a function, so you can use either syntax. Now, when you're doing state updates that don't depend on the old state, there is nothing wrong with just passing the object. So without the change counter, this is perfect. With the change counter, however, you should use that optional syntax where you actually receive 2 arguments, and I'm using an anonymous arrow function here, where the first argument is your old state, and I'll name it priv state for previous state, and the second argument are your current props in case you need those. Then you have your function body, and in that function body, you should return this new state object, like this. Now, of course, there, you're now not referring to this state, but you can refer to previous state change counter. And here React guarantees you that this will be the actual previous state as you would expect it for this setState update. So now if I save that, we'll see the exact same result as before. So if I go in here, inspect my app and the change counter, as I start typing, it goes up and it goes down, or it stays up when I decrease that, but it changes. And that is the expected behavior, but this is the better way and the recommended way of updating the state when you're depending on old state. And therefore, you'll see me use that throughout the course whenever we do depend on old state. Super important to keep that in mind. It's an important pattern, not an optional solution, but really the best practice for state updates that depend on the old state.